We hope you will enjoy this famous British TV show, The Poirot, and the value and effort that we bring you these shows of world-famous author Agatha Christie. If so, then why not buy us a cup of coffee? Look for the link in the description below. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you will not miss another video. Thank you for supporting this channel. It is appreciated.
Now, is there anything you want to see, monsieur? If you'd like to examine the room where the body was found— Poirot waved his hand.
No, not in the least. You have told me the only thing that interests me, Lord Cronshaw's views on the subject of drug-taking.
Well, then there's nothing you want to see?
Just one thing.
And what's that?
The set of china figures from which the costumes were copied.
Japp stared. Well, you're a funny one.
You can manage that for me?
Or come round to Berkeley Square now, if you like. Mr. Beltane, or his lordship, as I should say now, won't object. We set off at once in a taxi. The new Lord Cronshaw was not at home, but at Japp's request we were shown into the china room, where the gems of the collection were kept. Japp looked round him rather helplessly. "I don't see how you will even find the ones you want, monsieur." But Poirot had already drawn a chair in front of the mantelpiece and was hopping up upon it like a nimble robin. Above the mirror, on a small shelf to themselves, stood 6 china figures. Poirot examined them minutely, making a few comments to us as he did so.
Les voilà, the old Italian comedy. 3 pairs. Harlequin and Columbine, Pierrot and Pierrette, very dainty in white and green, and Pulcinello and Pulcinella in mauve and yellow. Oh, very elaborate, the costume of Punchinello, ruffles and frizzles, a hump, a high hat. Yes, as I thought, very elaborate.
He replaced the figures carefully and jumped down. Japp looked unsatisfied, but as Poirot had clearly no intention of explaining anything, the detective put the best face he could upon the matter. As we were preparing to leave, the master of the house came in, and Japp performed the necessary introductions. The 6th Viscount Cronshaw was a man of about 50, suave in manner, with a handsome, dissolute face, evidently an elderly roué, with the languid manner of a poseur. I took an instant dislike to him. He greeted us graciously enough, declaring he had heard great account of Poirot's skill, and placing himself at our disposal in every way.
The police are doing all they can, I know,
Poirot said. But I much fear the mystery of my nephew's death will never be cleared up. The whole thing seems utterly mysterious. Poirot was watching him keenly.
Your nephew had no enemies that you know of?
Oh, none whatever. No, I'm sure of that. He paused and then went on. If there are any questions you would like to ask?
Only one.
Poirot's voice was serious.
The costumes. They were reproduced exactly from your figurines?
To the smallest detail.
Thank you, my lord. That is all I wanted to be sure of. I wish you good day.
And what next? Inquired Japp as we hurried down the street. I've got to report at the yard, you know.
Bien, I will not detain you. I have one other little matter to attend to, and then—
Yes?
The case will be complete.
What? You don't mean it. You know who killed Lord Cronshaw?
Parfaitement.
Well, who was it? Eustace Beltane?
Ah, mon ami. You know my little weakness? Always I have a desire to keep the threads in my own hands up to the last minute, but have no fear. I will reveal all when the time comes. I want no credit. The affair shall be yours on the condition that you permit me to play out the denouement my own way.
Well, that's fair enough, said Japp. That is, if the denouement ever comes. But I say, you are an oyster, aren't you? Poirot smiled. Well, so long. I'm off to the yard. He strode off down the street and Poirot hailed a passing taxi. Where are we going now? I asked in lively curiosity.
To Chelsea to see the Davidsons.
He gave the address to the driver. What do you think of the new Lord Cronshaw? I asked.
What says my good friend Hastings?
I distrust him instinctively.
You think he is the wicked uncle of the storybooks, eh?
Well, don't you?
Me? I think he was most amiable towards us, said Poirot non-committally.
Well, because he had his reasons. Poirot looked at me, shook his head sadly, and murmured something that sounded like,
no method.
The Davidsons lived on the 3rd floor of a block of mansion flats. Mr. Davidson was out, we were told, but Mrs. Davidson was at home. We were ushered into a long, low room with garish oriental hangings. The air felt close and oppressive, and there was an overpowering fragrance of joss sticks. Mrs. Davidson came to us almost immediately, a small, fair creature whose fragility would have seemed pathetic and appealing had it not been for the rather shrewd and calculating gleam in her light blue eyes. Poirot explained our connection with the case, and she shook her head sadly. Poor Crunch, and poor Coco too. We were both so fond of her, and her death has been a terrible grief to us. What is it you want to ask me? Must I really go over all that dreadful evening again?
Oh, madame, believe me, I would not harass your feelings unnecessarily. Indeed, Inspector Japp has told me all that is needful. I only wish to see the costume you wore at the ball that night.
The lady looked somewhat surprised, and Poirot continued smoothly.
You comprehend, madame, that I work on the system of my country. There we always reconstruct the crime. It is possible that I may have an actual representation, and if so, you understand the costumes would be important.
Mrs. Davidson still looked a bit doubtful. Well, I've heard of reconstructing a crime, of course, she said, but I didn't know you were so particular about details. But I'll fetch the dress now. She left the room and returned almost immediately with a dainty wisp of white satin and green. Poirot took it from her and examined it, handing it back with a bow.
Merci, madame. I see you have had a misfortune to lose one of your green pom-poms, the one on the shoulder here.
Yes, it got torn off at the ball. I picked it up and gave it to poor Lord Cronshaw to keep for me.
That was after supper?
Yes.
Not long before the tragedy, perhaps?
A faint look of alarm came into Mrs. Davidson's pale eyes, and she replied quickly, Oh, no, long before that, well, quite soon after supper, in fact.
I see. Well, that is all. I will not derange you further. Bonjour, madame.
Well, I said as we emerged from the building, that explains the mystery of the green pom-pom.
I wonder.
Why, what do you mean?
You saw me examine the dress, Hastings?
Yes.
Eh bien, the pom-pom that was missing had not been wrenched off, as the lady said. On the contrary, it had been cut off, my friend. Cut off, with scissors. The threads were all quite even.
Oh, dear me, I exclaimed. This becomes more and more involved.
On the contrary, replied Poirot placidly, it becomes more and more simple.
Poirot, I cried, one day I shall murder you. Your habit of finding everything perfectly simple is aggravating to the last degree.
But when I explain, mon ami, is it not always perfectly simple?
Yes, that's the annoying part of it. I feel then that I could have done it myself.
And so you could, Hastings, so you could. If you would but take the trouble of arranging your ideas. Without method—
Oh, yes, I said hastily, for I knew Poirot's eloquence when started on his favourite theme only too well. Tell me, what do we do next? Are we really going to reconstruct the crime?
No, hardly that. Shall we say that the drama is over? But that I propose to add a 𝗔𝗂𝗱𝗁𝗁𝗁?
End of Disc 4. Disc 5.
The following Tuesday was fixed upon by Poirot as the day for this mysterious performance. The preparations greatly intrigued me. A white screen was erected at one side of the room, flanked by heavy curtains at either side. A man with some lighting apparatus arrived next, and finally a group of members of the theatrical profession, who disappeared into Poirot's bedroom, which had been rigged up as a temporary dressing-room. Shortly before 8, Japp arrived in no very cheerful mood. I gathered that the official detective hardly approved of Poirot's plan. A bit melodramatic, like all his ideas. But there, it can do no harm, and, as he says, it might save us a good bit of trouble. He's been very smart over the case. I was on the same scent myself, of course. I felt instinctively the chap was straining the truth here. But there I promised to let him play the thing out his own way. Ah, here's the crowd. His lordship arrived first, escorting Mrs. Mallaby, whom I had not as yet seen. She was a pretty, dark-haired woman and appeared perceptibly nervous. The Davidsons followed. Chris Davidson also I saw for the first time. He was handsome enough in a rather obvious style, tall and dark, with the easy grace of the actor. Poirot had arranged seats for the party facing the screen. This was illuminated by a bright light. Poirot switched out the other lights so that the room was in darkness except for the screen. Poirot's voice rose out of the gloom.
Monsieur, madame, a word of explanation. 6 figures in turn will pass across a screen. They are familiar to you. Pierrot and his Pierrette. Punchinello, the buffoon. And elegant Pulcinella. Beautiful Columbine, lightly dancing. Harlequin, the sprite invisible to man.
With these words of introduction, the show began. In turn, each figure that Poirot had mentioned bounded before the screen, stayed there a moment poised, and then vanished. The lights went up, and a sigh of relief went round. Everyone had been nervous, fearing they knew not what. It seemed to me that the proceedings had gone singularly flat. If the criminal was among us, and Poirot expected him to break down at the mere sight of a familiar figure, the device had failed singly, as it was almost bound to do. Poirot, however, appeared not a whit discomposed. He stepped forward, beaming.
Now, monsieur and madame, will you be so good as to tell me one at a time what it is that we have just seen? Will you begin, milord?
The gentleman looked rather puzzled. I'm afraid I don't quite understand.
Just tell me what we have been seeing.
I should say we have seen 6 figures passing in front of a screen and dressed to represent the personages in the old Italian comedy, or ourselves the other night.
Never mind the other night, milord, broke in Poirot. The first part of your speech was what I wanted. Madame, you agree with Milord Cronshaw?
He had turned as he spoke to Mrs. Mallaby.
Yes, of course. You agree that you have seen 6 figures representing the Italian comedy?
Why, certainly.
Monsieur Davidson, you too?
Yes.
Madame?
Yes.
Hastings, Jap, yes, you are all in accord?
He looked around upon us. His face grew rather pale, and his eyes were green as any cat's.
And yet, you are all wrong. Your eyes have lied to you, as they lied to you on the night of the Victory Ball. To see things with your own eyes, as they say, is not always to see the truth. One must see with the eyes of the mind. One must employ the little cells of grey. Know then that tonight, and on the night of the Victory Ball, you saw not 6 figures, but 5. See.
The lights went out again. A figure bounded in front of the screen. Pierrot.
"Who is that?" demanded Poirot. "Is it Pierrot?"
"Yes," we all cried.
"Look again!"
With a swift movement, the man divested himself of his loose Pierrot garb. There in the limelight stood glittering Harlequin. At the same moment there was a cry, and an overturned chair.
"Curse you!" snarled Davidson's voice. "Curse you! How did you guess?"
Then came the clink of handcuffs, and Jap's calm, official voice. "I arrest you, Christopher Davidson, charge of murdering Viscount Cronshaw. Anything you say may be used in evidence against you." It was a quarter of an hour later. A recherché, little supper, had appeared, and Poirot, beaming all over his face, was dispensing hospitality and answering our eager questions.
It was all very simple. The circumstances in which the green pom-pom was found suggested at once that it had been torn from the costume of the murderer. I dismissed Pierrette from my mind, since it takes considerable strength to drive a table knife home, and fixed upon Pierrot as the criminal. But Pierrot left the ball nearly 2 hours before the murder was committed, So he must either have returned to the ball later to kill Lord Cronshaw, or, eh bien, he must have killed him before he left. Was that impossible? Who had seen Lord Cronshaw after supper that evening? Only Mrs. Davidson, whose statement I suspected was a deliberate fabrication uttered with the object of accounting for the missing pompon, which of course she cut from her own dress to replace the one missing on her husband's costume. But then, Harlequin, who was seen in the box at 1:30, must have been an impersonation. For a moment, earlier, I had considered the possibility of Mr. Beltane being the guilty party. But with his elaborate costume, it was clearly impossible that he could have doubled the roles of Punchinello and Harlequin. On the other hand, to Davidson, a young man of about the same height as the murdered man and an actor by profession, the thing was simplicity itself. But one thing worried me. Surely a doctor could not fail to perceive the difference between a man who had been dead 2 hours and one who had been dead 10 minutes? Eh bien, the doctor did perceive it, but he was not taken to the body and asked, "How long has this man been dead?" On the contrary, he was informed that the man had been seen alive 10 minutes ago, and so he merely commented at the inquest on the abnormal stiffening of the limbs for which he was quite unable to account. All was now marching famously for my theory. Davidson had killed Lord Cronshaw immediately after supper, when, as you remember, he was seen to draw him back into the supper room. Then he departed with Miss Courtenay, left her at the door of her flat, instead of going in and trying to pacify her as he affirmed, and returned post-haste to the Colossus, but as Harlequin, not Pierrot. A simple transformation effected by removing his outer costume. The uncle of the dead man leaned forward, his eyes perplexed. But if so, he must have come to the ball prepared to kill his victim. Now, what earthly motive could he have had? The motive, that's what I can't get. Ah, there we come to the second tragedy, that of Miss Courtenay. There was one simple point which everyone overlooked. Miss Courtenay died of cocaine poisoning, but her supply of the drug was in the enamel box which was found on Lord Cronshaw's body. Where then did she obtain the dose which killed her? Only one person could have supplied her with it: Davidson. And that explains everything. It accounts for her friendship with the Davidsons and her demand that Davidson should escort her home. Lord Cronshaw, who was almost fanatically opposed to drug-taking, discovered that she was addicted to cocaine, and suspected that Davidson supplied her with it. Davidson doubtless denied this, but Lord Cronshaw determined to get the truth from Miss Courtenay at the ball. He could forgive the wretched girl, but he would certainly have no mercy on the man who made a living by trafficking in drugs. Exposure and ruin confronted Davidson. He went to the ball determined that Cronshaw's silence must be obtained at any cost. So was Coco's death an accident, then? I suspect that it was an accident cleverly engineered by Davidson. She was furiously angry with Cronshaw, first for his reproaches, and secondly for taking her cocaine from her. Davidson supplied her with more, and probably suggested her augmenting the dose as a defiance to old Cronsh. One other thing, I said. The recess and the curtain, how did you know about them? Why, mon ami, that was the most simple of all. Waiters had been in and out of that little room, so obviously the body could not have been lying where it was found on the floor. There must be some place in the room where it could be hidden. I deduced the curtain and the recess behind it. Davidson dragged the body there, and later, after drawing attention to himself in the box, he dragged it out again before finally leaving the hall. It was one of his best moves. He is a clever fellow. But in Poirot's green eyes, I read unmistakably the unspoken remark, but not quite so clever as Hercule Poirot.
The Wasp's Nest. Out of the house came John Harrison, and stood a moment on the terrace, looking out over the garden. He was a big man with a lean, cadaverous face. His aspect was usually somewhat grim, but when, as now, the rugged features softened into a smile, there was something very attractive about him. John Harrison loved his garden, and it had never looked better than it did on this August evening, summery and languorous. The rambler roses were still beautiful, sweet peas scented the air. A well-known creaking sound made Harrison turn his head sharply. Who was coming in through the garden gate? In another minute, an expression of utter astonishment came over his face, for the dandified figure coming up the path was the last he expected to see in this part of the world. "By all that's wonderful!" cried Harrison. "Monsieur Poirot!" It was indeed the famous Hercule Poirot, whose renown as a detective had spread over the whole world. "Yes," he said, "it is. You said to me once, if you are ever in this part of the world, come and see me. I take you at your word. I arrive." "And I'm obliged," said Harrison heartily. "Sit down and have a drink." With a hospitable hand, he indicated a table on the veranda, bearing assorted bottles. "I thank you," said Poirot, sinking down into a basket chair. "You have, I suppose, no syrup?" No, I thought not. A little plain soda water, then, and no whiskey." And he added in a feeling voice, as the other placed the glass beside him, "Alas, my moustaches are limp. It is this heat." "And what brings you into this quiet spot?" asked Harrison, as he dropped into another chair. "Pleasure? No, mon ami. Business." "Business? In this out-of-the-way place?" Poirot nodded gravely. "But yes, my friend, all crimes are not committed in crowds, you know." The other laughed. "I suppose that was rather an idiotic remark of mine. But what particular crime are you investigating down here? Or is that a thing I mustn't ask?" "Oh, you may ask," said the detective. "Indeed, I would prefer that you asked." Harrison looked at him curiously. He sensed something a little unusual in the other's manner. "You're investigating a crime, you say?" He advanced rather hesitatingly. "A serious crime?" "A crime of the most serious there is." "Or you mean murder?" So gravely did Hercule Poirot say the word that Harrison was quite taken aback. The detective was looking straight at him, and again there was something so unusual in his glance that Harrison hardly knew how to proceed. At last he said, "But I've heard of no murder?" "No," said Poirot. "You would not have heard of it." "Well, who has been murdered?" "As yet," said Poirot, "nobody." "What?" "That is why I said you would not have heard of it. I am investigating a crime that has not yet taken place." "But look here, that's nonsense." "Not at all. If one can investigate a murder before it has happened, surely that is very much better than afterwards. One might even, a little idea, prevent it." Harrison stared at him. "You're not serious, Monsieur Poirot?" "But yes, I am serious." "You really believe that a murder is going to be committed? Oh, it's absurd." Hercule Poirot finished the first part of the sentence without taking any notice of the exclamation. "Unless we can manage to prevent it, yes, mon ami, that is what I mean." "We?" "I said we. I shall need your cooperation." "Well, is that why you came down here?" Again Poirot looked at him, and again an indefinable something made Harrison uneasy. "I came here, Monsieur Harrison, because I like you." And then he added, in an entirely different voice, "I see, Monsieur Harrison, that you have a wasp's nest there. You should destroy it." The change of subject made Harrison frown in a puzzled way. He followed Poirot's glance and said in a bewildered voice, "Well, as a matter of fact, I'm going to, or rather, young Langton is. You remember Claude Langton? He was at that same dinner where I met you. He's coming over here this evening to take the nest. Rather fancies himself at the job." "Ah," said Poirot. "And how is he going to do it?" "Petrol and the garden syringe. He's bringing his own syringe over. It's a more convenient size than mine." "There is another way, is there not?" asked Poirot. "With cyanide of potassium?" Harrison looked a little surprised. "Well, yes, but that's rather dangerous stuff. Always a risk having it about the place." Poirot nodded gravely. "Yes, it is deadly poison." He waited a minute, and then repeated in a grave voice, "Deadly poison." "Useful if you want to do away with your mother-in-law, eh?" said Harrison with a laugh. But Hercule Poirot remained grave. "And you are quite sure, Monsieur Harrison, that it is with petrol that Monsieur Langton is going to destroy your wasp's nest?" "Oh, quite sure. Why?" "I wondered. I was at the chemist's in Barchester this afternoon. For one of my purchases I had to sign the poison book. I saw the last entry. It was for cyanide of potassium, and it was signed by Claude Langton." Harrison stared. "Well, that's odd," he said. "Langton told me the other day that he'd never dream of using the stuff. In fact, he said it oughtn't to be sold for the purpose." Poirot looked out over the garden. His voice was very quiet as he asked a question. "Do you like Langton?" The other started. The question somehow seemed to find him quite unprepared. I mean, of course I like him. Why shouldn't I?" "I only wondered," said Poirot placidly, "whether you did." And as the other did not answer, he went on, "I also wondered if he liked you." "What are you getting at, Monsieur Poirot? There's something in your mind I can't fathom." "I'm going to be very frank. You are engaged to be married, Monsieur Harrison. I know Miss Molly Dean. She is a very charming, a very beautiful girl. Before she was engaged to you, she was engaged to Claude Langton. She threw him over for you." Harrison nodded. "I do not ask what her reasons were. She may have been justified. But I tell you this, it is not too much to suppose that Langton has not forgotten or forgiven." "You're wrong, Monsieur Poirot. I swear you're wrong. Langton's been a sportsman. He's taken things like a man. He's been amazingly decent to me, gone out of his way to be friendly." "And that does not strike you as unusual? You use the word amazingly, but you do not seem to be amazed." "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" "I mean," said Poirot, and his voice had a new note in it, "that a man may conceal his hate till the proper time comes." "Hate?" Harrison shook his head and laughed. "The English are very stupid," said Poirot. "They think that they can deceive anyone, but that no one can deceive them. The sportsman, the good fellow, never will they believe evil of him, and because they are brave but stupid, sometimes they die when they need not die." "You're warning me," said Harrison in a low voice. "I see it now. What has puzzled me all along, you're warning me against Claude Langton. You came here today to warn me." Poirot nodded. Harrison sprang up suddenly. "But you were mad, Monsieur Poirot. This is England. Things don't happen like that here. Disappointed suitors don't go about stabbing people in the back and poisoning them. And you're wrong about Langton. The chap wouldn't hurt a fly." "The lives of flies are not my concern," said Poirot placidly. "And although you say Monsieur Langton would not take the life of one, yet you forget that he is even now preparing to take the lives of several thousand wasps." Harrison did not reply at once. The little detective in his turn sprang to his feet. He advanced to his friend and laid a hand on his shoulder. So agitated was he that he almost shook the big man, and as he did so he hissed into his ear, "Rouse yourself, my friend, rouse yourself, and look! Look where I am pointing! There on the bank, close to that tree root. See you, the wasps returning home, placid at the end of the day? In a little hour there will be destruction, and they know it not. There is no one to tell them. They have not, it seems, a Hercule Poirot. I tell you, Monsieur Harrison, I am down here on business. Murder is my business, and it is my business before it has happened, as well as afterwards." "At what time does Monsieur Langton come to take this wasp's nest?" "Langton would never. At what time?" "At 9 o'clock. But I tell you, you're all wrong. Langton would never." "These English," cried Poirot in a passion. He caught up his hat and stick and moved down the path, pausing to speak over his shoulder. "I do not stay to argue with you. I should only enrage myself, but you understand. I return at 9 o'clock. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot did not give him the chance. "I know what you would say. Langton would never, etc. Langton would never, but all the same, I return at 9 o'clock. But yes, it will amuse me. Put it like that. It will amuse me to see the taking of a wasp's nest. Another of your English sports." He waited for no reply, but passed rapidly down the path and out through the door that creaked. Once outside on the road, his pace slackened. His vivacity died down. His face became grave and troubled. Once he drew his watch from his pocket and consulted it. The hands pointed to 10 minutes past 8. "Over 3/4 of an hour," he murmured. "I wonder if I should have waited." His footsteps slackened. He almost seemed on the point of returning. Some vague foreboding seemed to assail him. He shook it off resolutely, however, and continued to walk in the direction of the village. But his face was still troubled, and once or twice he shook his head, like a man only partly satisfied. It was still some minutes off 9 when he once more approached the garden door. It was a clear, still evening. Hardly a breeze stirred the leaves. There was, perhaps, something a little sinister in the stillness, like the lull before a storm. Poirot's footsteps quickened ever so slightly. He was suddenly alarmed and uncertain. He feared he knew not what. And at that moment the garden door opened and Claude Langton stepped quickly out into the road. He started when he saw Poirot. "Oh, good evening." "Good evening, Monsieur Langton. You are early." Langton stared at him. "I don't know what you mean." "You have taken the wasp's nest?" "Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't." "Oh," said Poirot softly, "so you did not take the wasp's nest. What did you do then?" "Oh, just sat there and yarned a bit with old Harrison. I really must hurry along now, Monsieur Poirot. I'd no idea you were remaining in this part of the world." "I had business here, you see." "Oh, well, you'll find Harrison on the terrace. Sorry I can't stop." He hurried away. Poirot looked after him. A nervous young fellow, good-looking, with a weak mouth. "So, I shall find Harrison on the terrace," murmured Poirot. "I wonder." He went in through the garden door and up the path. Harrison was sitting in a chair by the table. He sat motionless and did not even turn his head as Poirot came up to him. "Ah, mon ami," said Poirot. "You are all right, eh?" There was a long pause, and then Harrison said in a queer, dazed voice, "What did you say?" "I said, are you all right?" "All right? Yes, I'm all right. Why not?" "You feel no ill effects. That is good." "Ill effects? From what?" "Washing soda." Harrison roused himself suddenly. "Washing soda? What do you mean?" Poirot made an apologetic gesture. "I infinitely regret the necessity, but I put some in your pocket." You put some in my pocket? What on earth for?" Harrison stared at him. Poirot spoke quietly and impersonally, like a lecturer coming down to the level of a small child. "You see, one of the advantages or disadvantages of being a detective is that it brings you into contact with the criminal classes. And the criminal classes, they can teach you some very interesting and curious things. There was a pickpocket once. I interested myself in him because for once in a way he had not done what they say he has done, and so I get him off. And because he is so grateful, he pays me in the only way he can think of, which is to show me the tricks of his trade. And it so happens that I can pick a man's pocket if I choose without his ever suspecting the fact. I lay one hand on his shoulder, I excite myself, and he feels nothing. But all the same, I have managed to transfer what is in his pocket to my pocket, and leave washing soda in its place. You see, continued Poirot dreamily, if a man wants to get at some poison quickly, to put in a glass unobserved, he positively must keep it in his right-hand coat pocket. There is nowhere else. I knew it would be there. He dropped his hand into his pocket and brought out a few white, lumpy crystals. Exceedingly dangerous, he murmured, to carry it like that. Loose. Calmly, and without hurrying himself, he took from another pocket a wide-mouthed bottle. He slipped in the crystals, stepped to the table, and filled up the bottle with plain water. Then, carefully corking it, he shook it until all the crystals were dissolved. Harrison watched him as though fascinated. Satisfied with his solution, Poirot stepped across to the nest. He uncorked the bottle, turned his head aside, and poured the solution into the wasp's nest. then stood back a pace or two watching. Some wasps that were returning alighted, quivered a little, and then lay still. Other wasps crawled out of the hole, only to die. Poirot watched for a moment or two, and then nodded his head and came back to the veranda. "A quick death," he said, "a very quick death." Harrison found his voice. "How much do you know?" Poirot looked straight ahead. "As I told you, I saw Claude Langton's name in the book. What I did not tell you was that almost immediately afterwards I happened to meet him. He told me he had been buying cyanide of potassium at your request to take a wasp's nest. That struck me as a little odd, my friend, because I remember that at that dinner of which you spoke, you held forth on the superior merits of petrol and denounced the buying of cyanide as dangerous and unnecessary." "Go on." "I knew something else. I had seen Claude Langton and Molly Dean together when they thought no one saw them. I do not know what lovers' quarrel it was that originally parted them and drove her into your arms, but I realized that misunderstandings were over, and that Miss Dean was drifting back to her love." "Go on." "I knew something more, my friend. I was in Harley Street the other day, and I saw you come out of a certain doctor's house. I know the doctor, and for what disease one consults him, and I read the expression on your face. I have seen it only once or twice in my lifetime, but it is not easily mistaken. It was the face of a man under sentence of death. I am right, am I not?" "Quite right. He gave me 2 months. "You did not see me, my friend, for you had other things to think about. I saw something else on your face, the thing that I told you this afternoon men try to conceal. I saw hate there, my friend. You did not trouble to conceal it, because you thought there were none to observe." "Go on," said Harrison. "There is not much more to say. I came down here, saw Langton's name by accident in the poison book, as I tell you, met him, and came here to you. I laid traps for you. You denied having asked Langton to get cyanide, or rather you expressed surprise at his having done so. You were taken aback at first at my appearance, but presently you saw how well it would fit in, and you encouraged my suspicions. I knew from Langton himself that he was coming at 8:30. You told me 9 o'clock, thinking I should come and find everything over, and so I knew everything." "Why did you come?" cried Harrison. "If only you hadn't come." Poirot drew himself up. "I told you," he said. "Murder is my business." "Murder? Suicide, you mean?" "No." Poirot's voice rang out sharply and clearly. "I mean murder. Your death was to be quick and easy, but the death you planned for Langton was to be the worst death any man can die. He bought the poison. He comes to see you, and he is alone with you. You die suddenly, and the cyanide is found in your glass, and Langton hangs. That was your plan." Again Harrison moaned. "Oh, why did you come? Why did you come?" "I have told you. But there is another reason. I liked you. Listen, mon ami. You are a dying man. You have lost the girl you loved. But there is one thing that you are not. You are not a murderer. Tell me now, are you glad or sorry that I came?" There was a moment's pause, and Harrison drew himself up. There was a new dignity in his face, the look of a man who has conquered his own baser self. He stretched out his hand across the table. "Thank goodness you came," he cried. "Oh, thank goodness you came." The Chocolate Box. It was a wild night. Outside the wind howled malevolently, and the rain beat against the windows in great gusts. Poirot and I sat facing the hearth, our legs stretched out to the cheerful blaze. Between us was a small table. On my side of it stood some carefully brewed hot toddy. On Poirot's was a cup of thick, rich chocolate, which I would not have drunk for £100. Poirot sipped the thick brown mess in the pink china cup and sighed with contentment. "Quelle belle fille," he murmured. "Yes, it's a good old world," I agreed. "Here I am with a job, and a good job, too. And here are you, famous." "Oh, mon ami," protested Poirot. "But you are, and rightly so. When I think back on your long line of successes, I'm positively amazed. I don't believe you know what failure is. He would be a droll kind of original who could say that. No, but seriously, have you ever failed?" "Innumerable times, my friend." "What would you? La bonne chance, it cannot always be on your side. I have been called in too late. Very often, another, working towards the same goal, has arrived there first. Twice I have been stricken down with the illness, just as I was on the point of success. One must take the downs with the ups, my friend." "Well, I didn't quite mean that," I said. "I mean, have you ever been completely down and out over a case through your own fault?" "Ah, I comprehend. You ask if I have ever made the complete prize ass of myself, as you say over here. Once, my friend." A slow, reflective smile hovered over his face. "Yes, once I made a fool of myself." He sat up suddenly in his chair. "See here, my friend, you have, I know, kept a record of my little successes. You should add one more story to the collection. The story of a failure." He leaned forward and placed a log on the fire. Then, after carefully wiping his hands on a little duster that hung on a nail by the fireplace, he leaned back and commenced his story. "That of which I tell you," said Monsieur Poirot, "took place in Belgium many years ago. It was at the time of the terrible struggle in France between Church and State. Monsieur Paul Déroulard was a French deputy of note. It was an open secret that the portfolio of a minister awaited him. He was among the bitterest of the anti-Catholic party, and it was certain that on his accession to power he would have to face violent enmity. He was in many ways a peculiar man. Though he neither drank nor smoked, he was nevertheless not so scrupulous in other ways. You comprehend, Hastings, c'était des femmes, toujours des femmes. He had married some years earlier a young lady from Brussels who had brought him a substantial dot. Undoubtedly, the money was useful to him in his career, as his family was not rich, though, on the other hand, he was entitled to call himself Monsieur le Baron if he chose. There were no children of the marriage, and his wife died after 2 years, the result of a fall downstairs. Among the property which she bequeathed to him was a house on the Avenue Louise in Brussels. It was in this house that his sudden death took place. The event coincided with the resignation of the minister whose portfolio he was to inherit. All the papers printed long notices of his career. His death, which had taken place quite suddenly in the evening after dinner, was attributed to heart failure. At that time, mon ami, I was, as you know, a member of the Belgian detective force. The death of Monsieur Paul Déroulard was not particularly interesting to me. I am, as you know, bon catholique, and his demise seemed to me fortunate. It was some 3 days afterwards, when my vacation had just begun, that I received a visit at my own apartments. A lady, heavily veiled, but evidently quite young, and I perceived at once that she was a jeune fille tout à fait comme il faut. "You are Monsieur Hercule Poirot?" she asked in a low, sweet voice. I bowed. "Of the detective service." Again I bowed. "Be seated, I pray of you, mademoiselle," I said. She accepted a chair and drew aside her veil. Her face was charming, though marred with tears, and haunted as though with some poignant anxiety. "Monsieur," she said, "I understand that you are now taking a vacation. Therefore you will be free to take up a private case. You understand that I do not wish to call in the police." I shook my head. "I fear what you ask is impossible, mademoiselle. Even though on vacation, I am still of the police." She leaned forward. "Écoutez, monsieur. All that I ask of you is to investigate. The result of your investigations you are at perfect liberty to report to the police. If what I believe to be true is true, we shall need all the machinery of the law." That placed a somewhat different complexion on the matter, and I placed myself at her service without more ado. A slight colour rose in her cheeks. "I thank you, monsieur. It is the death of Monsieur Paul Déroulard that I ask you to investigate. Comment? I exclaimed, surprised. Monsieur, I have nothing to go upon, nothing but my woman's instinct, but I am convinced, I tell you, that Monsieur Deroulard did not die a natural death. But surely the doctors may be mistaken. He was so robust, so strong. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I beseech of you to help me. The poor child was almost beside herself. She would have knelt to me. I soothed her as best I could. I will help you, mademoiselle. I feel almost sure that your fears are unfounded, but we will see. First, I will ask you to describe to me the inmates of the house. There are the domestics, of course, Jeannette, Felice, and Denise, the cook. She has been there many years. The others are simple country girls. Also there is François, but he too is an old servant. Then there is Monsieur Deroulard's mother, who lived with him, and myself. My name is Virginie Ménard. I am a poor cousin of the late Madame Deroulard, Monsieur Paul's wife, and I have been a member of their ménage for over 3 years. I have now described to you the household. There were also 2 guests staying at the house. And they were Monsieur de Saint-Elard, a neighbor of Monsieur Deroulard in France, also an English friend, Mr. John Wilson. Are they still with you? Mr. Wilson, yes, but Monsieur de Saint-Elard departed yesterday. And what is your plan, Mademoiselle Ménard? If you will present yourself at the house in half an hour's time, I will have arranged some story to account for your presence. I had better represent you to be connected with journalism in some way. I shall say you have come from Paris, and that you have brought a card of introduction from Monsieur de Saint-Elard. Madame Deroulard is very feeble in health, and will pay little attention to details. On Mademoiselle's ingenious pretext, I was admitted to the house, and after a brief interview with the dead deputy's mother, who was a wonderfully imposing and aristocratic figure, though obviously in failing health, I was made free of the premises. I wonder, my friend, continued Poirot, whether you can possibly figure to yourself the difficulties of my task. Here was a man whose death had taken place 3 days previously. If there had been foul play, only one possibility was admissible: poison. And I had no chance of seeing the body. And there was no possibility of examining or analyzing any medium in which the poison could have been administered. There were no clues, false or otherwise, to consider. Had the man been poisoned? Had he died a natural death? I, Hercule Poirot, with nothing to help me, had to decide. First, I interviewed the domestics, and with their aid I recapitulated the evening. I paid especial notice to the food at dinner and the method of serving it. The soup had been served by Monsieur Deroulard himself from a tureen. Next, a dish of cutlets, then a chicken. Finally, a compote of fruits. And all placed on the table, and served by Monsieur himself. The coffee was brought in a big pot to the dinner table. Nothing there, mon ami. Impossible to poison one without poisoning all. After dinner, Madame Deroulard had retired to her own apartments, and Mademoiselle Virginie had accompanied her. The 3 men had adjourned to Monsieur Deroulard's study. Here they had chatted amicably for some time, when suddenly, without any warning, the deputy had fallen heavily to the ground. Monsieur de Saint-Elard had rushed out, and told François to fetch the doctor immediately. He said it was without doubt an apoplexy, explained the man. But when the doctor arrived, the patient was past help. Mr. John Wilson, to whom I was presented by Mademoiselle Virginie, was what was known in those days as a regular John Bull Englishman, middle-aged and burly. His account, delivered in very British French, was substantially the same. Deroulard went very red in the face, and down he fell. There was nothing further to be found out there. Next I went to the scene of the tragedy, the study, and was left alone there at my own request. So far, there was nothing to support Mademoiselle Ménard's theory. I could not but believe that it was a delusion on her part. Evidently, she had entertained a romantic passion for the dead man, which had not permitted her to take a normal view of the case. Nevertheless, I searched the study with meticulous care. It was just possible that a hypodermic needle might have been introduced into the dead man's chair in such a way as to allow of a fatal injection. The minute puncture it would cause was likely to remain unnoticed. But I could discover no sign to support the theory. I flung myself down in the chair with a gesture of despair. "Enfin, I abandon it," I said out loud. "There is not a clue anywhere. Everything is perfectly normal." As I said the words, my eyes fell on a large box of chocolates, standing on a table nearby, and my heart gave a leap. It might not be a clue to Monsieur Deroulard's death, but here at least was something that was not normal. I lifted the lid. The box was full, untouched, not a chocolate was missing, but that only made the peculiarity that had caught my eye even more striking. For you see, Hastings, while the box itself was pink, the lid was blue. Now, one often sees a blue ribbon on a pink box and vice versa, but a box of one color and a lid of another? No, decidedly. Ça ne se voit jamais. I did not as yet see that this little incident was of any use to me, yet I determined to investigate it as being out of the ordinary. I rang the bell for François, and asked him if his late master had been fond of sweets. A faint, melancholy smile came to his lips. "Passionately fond of them, monsieur. He would always have a box of chocolates in the house. He did not drink wine of any kind, you see." "Yet this box has not been touched." I lifted the lid to show him. "Pardon, monsieur, but that was a new box, purchased on the day of his death, the other being nearly finished." "Then the other box was finished on the day of his death?" I said slowly. "Yes, monsieur. I found it empty in the morning and threw it away." "Did Monsieur Deroulard eat sweets at all hours of the day?" "Usually after dinner, monsieur." I began to see light. "François," I said, "you can be discreet?" "If there is need, monsieur." "Bon. Know, then, that I am of the police. Can you find me that other box?" "Without doubt, monsieur. It will be in the dustbin." He departed, and returned a few minutes later with a dust-covered object. It was the duplicate of the box I held, save for the fact that this time the box was blue and the lid was pink. I thanked François, recommended him once more to be discreet, and left the house in the Avenue Louise without more ado. Next, I called upon the doctor who had attended Monsieur Deroulard. With him I had a difficult task. He entrenched himself prettily behind a wall of learned phraseology, but I fancied that he was not quite as sure about the case as he would like to be. "There have been many curious occurrences of the kind," he observed, when I managed to disarm him somewhat. "A sudden fit of anger, a violent emotion, after a heavy dinner, c'est entendu. Then, with an excess of rage, the blood flies to the head, and there you are. But Monsieur Deroulard had had no violent emotion. No? I ascertained that he had been having a stormy altercation with Monsieur de Saint-Alard. Why should he? C'est évident." The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Was not Monsieur de Saint-Alard a Catholic of the most fanatical? Their friendship was being ruined by this question of church and state. Not a day passed without discussions. To Monsieur de Saint-Alard, Deroulard appeared almost as Antichrist. This was unexpected, and gave me food for thought. "One more question, doctor. Would it be possible to introduce a fatal dose of poison into a chocolate?" "It would be possible, I suppose," said the doctor slowly. "Pure prussic acid would meet the case if there were no chance of evaporation, and a tiny globule of anything might be swallowed unnoticed. But it does not seem a very likely supposition. A chocolate full of morphine or strychnine?" He made a wry face. "You comprehend, Monsieur Poirot, one bite would be enough. The unwary one would not stand upon ceremony." "Thank you, Monsieur le Docteur." I withdrew. Next I made inquiries of the chemists, especially those in the neighborhood of the Avenue Louise. It is good to be of the police. I got the information I wanted without any trouble. Only in one case could I hear of any poison having been supplied to the house in question. This was some eye drops of atropine sulfate for Madame Deroulard. Atropine is a potent poison, and for the moment I was elated. but the symptoms of atropine poisoning are closely allied to those of 𝗏𝗏, and bear no resemblance to those I was studying. Besides, the prescription was an old one. Madame de Roulard had suffered from cataracts in both eyes for many years. I was turning away discouraged, when the chemist's voice called me back. "Un moment, Monsieur Poirot. I remember the girl who brought that prescription. She said something about having to go on to the English chemist. You might try there." I did. Once more enforcing my official status, I got the information I wanted. On the day before Monsieur de Roulard's death, they had made up a prescription for Mr. John Wilson. Not that there was any making up about it. They were simply little tablets of trinitrine. I asked if I might see some. He showed me them, and my heart beat faster, for the tiny tablets were of chocolate. "Is it a poison?" I asked. "No, monsieur." "Can you describe to me its effect?" "It lowers the blood pressure. It is given for some forms of heart trouble, angina pectoris, for instance. It relieves the arterial tension, in arteriosclerosis." I interrupted him. "Ma foi! This rigmarole says nothing to me. Does it cause the face to flush? Oh, certainly it does. And supposing I ate 10 or 20 of your little tablets, what then?" "I should not advise you to attempt it," he replied dryly. "And yet you say it is not poison." "Oh, there are many things not called poison which can kill a man," he replied as before. I left the shop elated. At last things had begun to march. I now knew that John Wilson had the means for the crime. But what about the motive? He had come to Belgium on business, and had asked Monsieur de Roulard, whom he knew slightly, to put him up. There was apparently no way in which de Roulard's death could benefit him. Moreover, I discovered by inquiries in England that he had suffered for some years from that painful form of heart disease known as angina. Therefore, he had a genuine right to have those tablets in his possession. Nevertheless, I was convinced that someone had gone to the chocolate box, opening the full one first by mistake, and had abstracted the contents of the last chocolate, cramming in instead as many little trinitrine tablets as it would hold. The chocolates were large ones. Between 20 or 30 tablets I felt sure could have been inserted. But who had done this? There were 2 guests in the house. John Wilson had the means. Saint-Hilaire had the motive. Remember, he was a fanatic, and there is no fanatic like a religious fanatic. Could he by any means have got hold of John Wilson's trinitrine? Another little idea came to me. Ah, you smiled at my little ideas. Why had Wilson run out of trinitrine? Surely he would bring an adequate supply from England. I called once more at the house in the Avenue Louise. Wilson was out, but I saw the girl who did his room, 𝗤𝗏𝗄𝐿. I demanded of her immediately whether it was not true that Monsieur Wilson had lost a bottle from his washstand some little time ago. The girl responded eagerly. It was quite true. She, 𝗤𝗏𝗄𝐿, had been blamed for it. The English gentleman had evidently thought that she had broken it, and did not like to say so, whereas she had never even touched it. Without doubt, it was Jeannette, always nosing around where she had no business to be. I calmed the flow of words, and took my leave. I knew now all that I wanted to know. It remained for me to prove my case. That, I felt, would not be easy. I might be sure that Saint-Hilaire had removed the bottle of trinitrine from John Wilson's washstand, but to convince others, I would have to produce evidence, and I had none to produce. Never mind. I knew that was the great thing. You remember our difficulty in the Styles case, Hastings? There again, I knew, but it took me a long time to find the last link which made my chain of evidence against the murderer complete. I asked for an interview with Mademoiselle Ménard. She came at once. I demanded of her the address of Monsieur de Saint-Hilaire. A look of trouble came over her face. "Why do you want it, monsieur?" "Mademoiselle, it is necessary." She seemed doubtful, troubled. "He can tell you nothing. He is a man whose thoughts are not in this world. He hardly notices what goes on around him." "Possibly, mademoiselle. Nevertheless, he was an old friend of Monsieur de Roulard. There may be things he can tell me, things of the past, old grudges, old love affairs." The girl flushed and bit her lip. As you please, but I feel sure now that I have been mistaken. It was good of you to accede to my demand, but I was upset or almost distraught at the time. I see now that there is no mystery to solve. Leave it. I beg of you, monsieur. I eyed her closely. Mademoiselle, I said, it is sometimes difficult for a dog to find a scent, but once he has found it, nothing on earth will make him leave it. That is, if he is a good dog. And I, mademoiselle, 𝗖𝗀𝗀𝗃𝗃 am a very good dog. Without a word, she turned away. A few minutes later, she returned with the address written on a sheet of paper. I left the house. François was waiting for me outside. He looked at me anxiously. There is no news, monsieur? None as yet, my friend. Ah, pauvre Monsieur Deroulard, he sighed. I, too, was of his way of thinking. I do not care for priests. Not that I would say so in the house. The women are all devout. A good thing, perhaps. Madame est très pieuse. Et Mademoiselle Virginie aussi. Mademoiselle Virginie, was she très pieuse? Thinking of the tear-stained, passionate face I had seen that first day, I wondered. Having obtained the address of Monsieur de Saint-Élard, I wasted no time. I arrived in the neighborhood of his chateau in the Ardennes, but it was some days before I could find a pretext for gaining admission to the house. In the end, I did. How do you think? As a plumber, mon ami. It was the affair of a moment to arrange a neat little gas leak in his bedroom. I departed for my tools and took care to return with them at an hour when I knew I should have the field pretty much to myself. What I was searching for I hardly knew. The one thing needful I could not believe there was any chance of finding. He would never have run the risk of keeping it. Still, when I found the little cupboard above the washstand locked, I could not resist the temptation of seeing what was inside it. The lock was quite a simple one to pick. The door swung open. It was full of old bottles. I took them up one by one with a trembling hand. Suddenly I uttered a cry. Figure to yourself, my friend, I held in my hand a little phial with an English chemist's label. On it were the words, Trinitrine tablets, one to be taken when required, Mr. John Wilson. I controlled my emotion, closed the cupboard, slipped the bottle in my pocket, and continued to repair the gas leak. One must be methodical. When I left the chateau and took the train for my own country as soon as possible, I arrived in Brussels late that night.
If you enjoyed this audio and the value and effort that we bring you these audios of world-class authors, then why not buy us a cup of coffee? Look for the link below in the description area. Make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you will not miss another audio. Thank you for supporting this channel. It is appreciated.